The cry cut through the marble hush like a siren. It began high and small, and then swelled, a raw animal sound that seemed to rebound off the gilded banister and the framed ocean photographs until even the house felt off balance. Chandeliers chimed faintly as if startled. On a far landing, a woman with a mop and a name tag pressed to her chest stopped mid-step and listened. Maya William had been on the job 5 days. She had not expected to be the answer to a sound like that. She had expected a checklist: dust the scones on the mantel, refill the salt shakers in the chef's larder, scrub toothpaste out of a tile grout. She had expected small errands, quick cash, a room that smelled faintly of citrus and expensive detergent. She had not expected a child's cry to fold itself through the corridors and unfurl something in her chest she had thought exhausted. Her hands went cold around the mop handle. The sound tugged at a memory like a seam. Germain as a boy, reaching under a diner table for the hum of a refrigerator compressor, fingers clapping when the pattern soothed him. The nights when skin on skin saved him from a fit no medicine could anticipate. Her mother's voice teaching her the first signs. Be steady. Be below the noise. The cry hit a high note and broke. Maya set the mop against the banister and walked toward the nursery. The door to the wing stood ajar, light pooling like milk on the carpet. The nursery was a study in careful design, muted stars projected against the ceiling, soft rugs, a low shelf of wooden blocks lined like soldiers. In the middle of it, a boy rocked on his knees, fists tight in his hair, mouth open in a sound that had no words. Eli. The name came like a label from someplace else, a tag hung on the moment. It was stitched with the color of a life that did not belong to hers. He was small for his 6 years, silent mostly, the way some children are silent because their mouths find other languages first. Now his face was wet, and his breath came in short, jagged pushes. Maya stepped in without asking. She moved slow and measured, the way she had learned to move when Germain was a young man and the world supplied too much input. She lowered herself to the floor by the projector, careful to let her shadow cross the star field like a boat sliding under a moon. The boy did not notice her at first. His eyes had gone inward, fixed on a rhythm only he could hear. She let her hands rest on her knees and watched him. She did not speak. She signed. A simple circle at her chest, an echo of calm. Her fingers were not showy, they were grammar. Her thumb brushed her fingertips to mean sit, a reminder, a small anchor. She remembered how Germain's fingers had learned language when his voice had not. Sometimes a touch and a pattern and a patient repetition were all that stood between a storm and the hush after. Eli's shoulders stuttered, his hands tightened then eased. He blinked as if arriving from a distance. His mouth worked, sound turned into a breath, and then into a small, unsteady laugh. He reached for the hem of his sleeve, and then, as though testing the world, extended his hand. Maya opened her palm. He placed his small fingers in hers, like placing a coin in a slot. He did not look up fully. He did not need to. The cry had retreated. The house exhaled. "No one goes in there," a man said from the doorway. Preston Vale stood in the threshold like a question posed in glass. He was taller than his suit suggested and thinner than his suit admitted. He watched as if trying to measure the physics of what had just happened. Someone had entered his child's crisis and managed something like order. For weeks, the house had been an engine of formality around brokenness. Meals left untouched on sideboards, a piano that still had a ribbon of Emma's lipstick pressed over a key, Preston's hands tapping the same anxious note on his watch. Grief had made him a cautious machine. He kept the edges of his world in neat, guarded lines. He began, then stopped, as if the syllable of a profession might change the fact. He had been used to qualifications, diplomas, references, agencies with laminated cards and phone numbers on the back. He was not used to the quiet that could stop a child's cry without a label. "Maya William," she said, and let the name sit between them. It was a name that did not belong to the house, and that fact made prestige curdle into something brittle. She had come for a temporary contract, cleaning errands, one of those roles that floats through the city and keeps people like her billable. She had taken the job for Loretta, for Aunt Lorraine, for therapy bills on a niece's case file, for a rent check that made the difference between sleep and a couch with springs biting. Her motives were ordinary and stern. Compassion ran alongside need, and neither could be held as purely noble. Preston's eyes tracked the circle of her hand with Eli's, then returned to her face. He had the habit, when unsure, of cataloguing practicalities. He catalogued: no badge, no uniform other than a faded polo, ink mark on her knuckle. Then he catalogued something less tidy, a steadiness in her presence that belonged to human economies not measured by bank accounts. She calmed him? Lionel Hatch, the security advisor, asked as he stepped up behind Preston, arms folded, a radio at his hip. His voice had the consideration of someone who thought in risk assessments. Maya's voice was small. He needed something like a pattern. He likes the lights. He likes when someone uses their hands. Preston nodded as if learning a new map. The nursery hummed softly. The projector painted waves across a small, sleeping elephant on the shelf. There was a photograph on the dresser of a woman with Emma's laugh and light, and Preston's jaw clenched around memory. "Can you stay?" he asked finally. He did not say, "Be my nanny" or "live in." He said the ordinary words of an extraordinary request. He offered a practical solution to a persistent problem. He offered money and the warmth of the house, and behind both he carried a lock of something deeper, the fear that no one knew how to reach his son. Maya's first thought was the check with the name Loretta used to hold in front of her like a talisman. She imagined the lives that hinged on her answer, the groceries, the van insurance, Jermaine's new occupational therapist. She also felt the subtle danger. The Vale household moved in the currents of power and rumor. To cross from employee to resident in such a place was to step into lessons of obligation and exposure. The house would observe her. It might, in some corners, expect more than she could give, but she remembered Jermaine's hands in hers, and the nights when empathy and competence had been the only currencies that mattered. The question narrowed to a single line: could she do this job? Could she keep a child safe and teach a man to let love reach through his grief? "Yes," she said. The syllable was the polite economy of an answer and more. An offer of presence. Preston let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The staff watched from the doorway. Mrs. Green's face was a book that had been read many times, pages of propriety and a margin note of skepticism. "You sure about that?" she asked Maya under her breath, not unkind. The house had ways of changing people in small, invisible increments. The old housekeepers had seen the pattern of helpers come and go like seasons. Mrs. Green had learned to believe in slow endurance over flashy miracles. Preston handed her a card, numbers of house staff, the proper channels to request time off, an emergency contact. The card lay in Maya's palm like a new map. For a second she wondered if she should sign anything, write a line or two to seal the obligation. Then she decided to keep the card and the option of leaving it unsigned. The house would teach her a new grammar of privacy and proximity. She accepted the position. The way she said yes was deliberate, not triumphant. There was no cinematic music, no sudden smile. There was only a steady nod, a small continuance of the life she already held. Family obligations, a will to be useful, and the uncanny understanding that some doors open only once. If this story moves you, like and subscribe to Follow the Full Journey. The next days arranged themselves into patterns. The house, which had once been a museum of absence, began to breathe differently under the slow rhythm Maya introduced. She arrived before dawn most mornings, when the mansion wore its most honest light. Silver, patient, unmarred by the day's business. She would make tea for Eli, plain warm water in a blue cup with a chip on the rim, and place it on a small tray so he could feel the weight of the world set beside him. She learned the exact angle to warm a fleece blanket without waking a sensory aversion. She learned what kinds of motions soothed and which sent the boy into flares. She learned that the sound of a gospel hum at a low pitch, an old tune her Aunt Loretta used to sing, could anchor him like a dock. Preston watched these rituals like a scientist watching an experiment that kept surprising him. He had been a man of spreadsheets, of cities built with his name on the glass, and an algorithm for everything. Care in his old domains was measurable in graphs and quarterly returns. Here, in the nursery, results arrived without metrics. Sometimes Eli would accept a cut of apple, sometimes he would not. Sometimes he would let Maya touch the side of his face and breathe. Sometimes he would turn away. Progress was not a line. Progress was a constellation of small, almost invisible adjustments. Maya kept notes in a cheap notebook she bought at a corner store. She wrote down kernels of information, what Eli preferred for texture. Kinetic sand worked like a tiny universe. What sound comforted him, the low hummed tune, times of day when the world felt more hazardous for him. She kept the notebook tucked in her pocket like a map to a place others could not see. In it, she recorded successes with the same tone she would have used to write a grocery list. Simple, factual. Today, he touched my palm. Today, he signed more and waited. Small verbs became treasures. Dr. Lydia Chen entered this life with the soft authority of someone trained to see patterns without rushing to tidy them. She wore understated glasses and the practical shoes of a clinician. Her voice was precise, but kind. She described autism with the language of behavior and environment, attachment, predictability, and sensory modulation, she said in their first consultation, unfolding a chart as if to map a coastline neither of them could control. She validated Maya's instincts and encouraged collaboration. Consistency matters more than intensity, Dr. Chen told Preston during an early meeting in his glass office. She pushed the chair around so she could look at him across, not above. Keep the routines, keep the language. Don't make his world larger than it needs to be just because there's guilt or grief in the room. Safety has edges. Preston nodded. He had known he would have to buy patience as much as toys. He did not know how to buy warmth when he had always been taught to buy control. He tried to practice, at first clumsily, a signed dada that looked too practiced, a small laugh that tried too hard. Maya watched him attempting sign language in the evenings, a man folding awkwardly into a new grammar, and she made a point to correct his wrist angle gently. "Make it slower," she told him once, offering the motion the way you might place a book into a child's hand. Over time, the motions between them grew gentler. Preston learned the economy of presence, how to sit without fixing, how to breathe without solving. He watched as Maya folded Eli's socks with an almost holy care. He listened when she hummed, and sometimes, very late at night, when the nursery light had been turned down and the house had given up on pretending it could pretend, he found himself watching an archived video Emma had left. The archive was a small private world Preston had resisted. Emma had left these videos like a lifeline of ordinary moments that could not be claimed by grief. In them, she sat at the piano, laughing, her hair catching light. She signed silly little things to the camera, words like tickle and cookie, making faces at a son who was not always interested in faces. Preston had avoided them for months. Watching them felt like letting an intruder into a wound. But Maya encouraged him, not with sentimental coaxing, but with a curatorial patience. "Play them," she'd said one evening when Preston stood by an armchair with the remote like a relic. He needs to see her voice. He needs to know it's safe. And so Preston pressed play. Emma's recorded laugh sailed out of the old monitor like a small bird. It did not redeem everything, but it made a place in the room for a kind of memory that was not all loss. For the first time in months, Preston found himself smiling without self-consciousness. Eli's fingers twitched. He watched the pixels of his mother like an ember. A small bridge formed, and not one stone of it was laid by a single hand. Maya's life outside the manor continued to fold into the work. She called Loretta on Thursday afternoons. Loretta's voice insisted on the ordinary details first. Did you eat? Did you sleep? Then moved to the practical. "You do right by that boy," Loretta said once. "You keep your heart and your head both. Don't you think the world will take advantage if you give them only the heart?" Loretta had the blunt wisdom of someone who had seen families rebuilt and families broken, sometimes by the same hands. Aunt Lorraine supplied casseroles and an occasional reminder to pick up medication. Maya's family anchored her. The bills, the stories, the one-night sleepovers, where Jermaine lay on a mattress and traced constellations on the ceiling with his finger. Those nights kept her steady when the Vale house demanded perfect faces. The household staff formed a kind of chorus around these small new rituals. Mrs. Green, with a slow, careful skepticism, watched Maya's manners and tested them with 100 little questions that sounded like nothing. "You from the old neighborhood?" she'd ask when there was a lull. "You got family back home?" And when Maya named Jermaine, the old woman softened. "That's a good bone in you, then," she said once, and the words were a benediction. The chefs adjusted recipes to the sensory sensitivities she noted. Less cumin, more texture-appropriate puddings. Lionel upgraded a corner of the nursery security to a softer lens, his tone an apology wrapped as protocol. "You'll never be alone with him without someone knowing," he told her once. But Lionel's eyes watched her with a different kind of interest. He had spent his life learning to predict risks, and now found he could not predict this. There was no threat, but there was an unfolding he could not quantify. Eli responded in small, heartbreaking measures. There was the day he pressed his ear to the window to listen to the rain, and did not beguile when thunder rolled. There was the slender victory when he let Maya braid the tiny hair at his temple, a gesture he had only allowed to Emma in the past. He began to reach for the blue cup Maya used for tea, then to imitate the small motion of winding the cup to his mouth. He learned more as a sign, not a word yet, but a predictable vector of desire. Once, in an early afternoon that smelled of citrus and rain, Eli surprised them both. They were in the garden, sun washing the leaves in a soft green. Preston had come out. He had promised himself a walk, and he stood by the magnolia as if cataloguing the bark. Maya held Eli's hand. He had been building a small fortress of blocks when a bee landed near the sandbox. The boy went very still. His hands fluttered over the wood like someone checking a surface for danger. Maya signed, slow and calm, the motion for look. She let her fingers draw a circle on his palm, the same way she had taught Jermaine to orient to the world. Preston watched, and then, almost without thinking, he mimicked her with a ridiculous perfection. He made the circle with clumsy fingers and then laughed at his own awkwardness. The laugh surprised him. It sounded like someone else's voice. Eli glanced up, and for a second his mouth made a sound that was only half a laugh. He repeated the motion, placing both hands palm out like sails. Then he reached without caution, and there, between the magnolia roots, Preston found himself leaning in and planting a small, clumsy kiss on Eli's head. The moment had none of the tidy closure romance movies habitually promise. It was messy and human, a man discovering how to be present, a boy testing safety, a caregiver watching a family reconfigure itself into something not wholly invented by money. Love, here, was not an explosion. It was a rearrangement of furniture and priorities. Their quiet domesticity attracted its own kind of attention. Within the house, staff traded small notes of approval. Outside, rumor moved faster. People with less noble motives noticed that a woman with a mop had moved into a household of glass and marble. Some whispered admiration, others saw opportunity or insult. A local blog that trafficked in gossip mentioned a mysterious new aide at the Vale mansion and attached 3 grainy photographs of a woman with a child's hand in hers, posted in the evening when nothing better happened on the internet. Preston tried not to care about tabloids. He had bought privacy as a line item for years. But the first time he noticed the mention, he felt a sudden, sharp shiver. His life had been a series of transactions with clear metrics. Vulnerability had to be measured. He had not realized that allowing someone like Maya into his home would make his private grief legible to a world eager to render stories. Maya noticed the change in the way Lionel checked perimeter cameras. He began to cross-reference staff activities against the timeline of the blog post. He asked questions about past volunteers, background checks, the provenance of every modern face in the staff roster. "I don't like the traffic," he said one morning, not unkindly. The house had a way of making each of them small and large at the same time. Here, security had the clench of a father who could not bear his child to be misread. One evening, after a small victory, Eli had pressed his palm to the projector light and laughed at the spinning stars. Preston sat on the nursery floor with them both. Emma's video played on a laptop propped against the rocker. The house outside hummed like a far city. Inside, the three of them shared a bowl of fruit and the slow peace of a living room that had learned its own rhythm. "Maya," Preston said then, quiet, "I don't know how to thank you." It was a man learning to find words that were not checks on spreadsheets. He brushed his fingers against the boy's sleeve and then did something more dangerous. He leaned his head back and let his eyes close for a breath, as if allowing himself the shame of gratefulness. She shook her head. "You don't need to," she said. "You need to keep being here." He opened his eyes and looked at her like a person who had been taught to see numbers instead of faces, and was slowly relearning how to look. There was no script for the kind of gratitude he wanted to give, no charitable donation, no foundation named after a loved one, just an earnest, stumbling promise to try to be present. For a man who had been used to fixing things with money, presence felt like a foreign currency. The house softened around them. Someone left a pot of tea unmarked by bitterness. Mrs. Green started adding extra cinnamon to the morning porridge because she liked the way Eli would eat it. The gardener pruned the hedges in a pattern that let light fall across the magnolia in a way that suited afternoon naps. Small people, each making small moves to build a differently functioning day. Maya's own evenings filled up differently too. She met with Dr. Chen weekly at first, then every other week. They discussed strategies, how to make transitions easier, how to frame sound, which toys to rotate out to avoid habituation. Dr. Chen coached Preston on body language. "He needs predictability," she told him. "He needs rhythm more than rhetoric." Preston listened and he practiced. He signed slowly to Eli in the mornings, fumbling at first, then with a steadier hand. Once he wiped a tear from his own cheek without announcing it, and confessed to Maya in a voice that barely rose above the low hum of the projector. "I used to think grief was something you managed like a spreadsheet. Now I know it's more like learning a language you never thought you'd speak." Maya's answer came without sermon. "Then learn it the way you said you'd learn it," she told him, "slowly, with mistakes, with someone to correct you kindly." That night, after the house had settled and the staff had cleared for the late shift, Preston sat not at a desk, but beside the nursery door. He watched the silhouette of a woman bending over a child. He thought about the name of the house, Vale, and how names sometimes felt like predictions. He thought about Emma and the daughter of memory who existed in pixels on a screen. He thought about the cost of letting someone in. He thought about the shape of his son's fingers in Maya's palm and felt, under his ribs, something thaw. For Maya, the work was part devotion and part labor. She kept the edges of her life outside, deliberate and strong. She wrote bills in the same hand she used to note Eli's small triumphs. She prayed, sometimes, not in any formal way, but in a steady, human pleading that nothing reckless would harm the small temple she tended. She had learned to be wary of being credited with miracles. She had seen too many stories that tried to shape poor, capable people into saviors. She also kept a ledger in her head about what the job meant for her family. Loretta needed a new night guard for a door at the community center. Jermaine had started a new occupational therapy program and needed 3 consecutive months of payments to guarantee a place. These were practical things, calculable in the currency of time and patience. In the corner of their routine, the house preserved a little archive. Emma's things were kept with a delicate fidelity. An old scarf folded on a chair, a small tin of buttons in a drawer. Preston had not thrown any of it away. He had not dared. Sometimes at night, Maya would find him in the archive room, watching Emma's videos with a blank expression, as if he had been confronted with a ghost whose presence hurt in the right places. Their slow formation of family was not free from friction. There were moments of misreading when Preston thought discipline meant ordering a new schedule without consultation, when Maya's insistence on routine was taken by a house manager as a refusal to be flexible. There were microaggressions too, a comment about how lucky they were to have a woman willing to live in, said kindly, but with an undercurrent that made Maya's shoulders tighten. She answered with the economy of someone used to deflecting micro-insults and conserving energy for the tasks that mattered. Then, toward the end of a week that had been soft with small victories, Maya noticed something outside the magnolia. She had taken Eli for a walk in the garden because the light that afternoon seemed merciful. They walked with a small blue cup in Eli's hand and a blanket draped over his shoulders. Eli hummed, a private sound he had recently begun to offer when content, and the bushes rippled with the mid-afternoon breeze. From the line of hedges, a shadow bobbed. For a second she thought a deer had wandered too close to the estate, then realized it was a glint, the thin black tube of a camera lens catching sunlight between leaves. The figure holding it was farther back, hidden, an angle trained where the magnolia opened to a path. The man or woman moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who spent their work measuring other people's private moments for a living. A flash of a phone on a strap, a quick shutter that made no sound but left a metallic taste in the mouth. Maya's shoulders tightened. She did not make a scene. Instead, she tucked Eli closer and shielded him with her body, the way she used to shield Jermaine from a glare that might bruise his calm. The intruder stepped back and disappeared into the city noise. That quick motion, small as a beetle's flight, left the air charged. Preston noticed, of course. He had an eye for change, for anything that might suggest an imbalance. Lionel's team checked the cameras and found the footage, a person on the perimeter, a few grainy frames, a shirt that could be catalogued. It was nothing decisive, just a few pixels and a pattern, but it was enough to prick the skin. Someone on the staff whispered about a blog. Someone else mentioned a local paper with a hunger for a story. Preston slammed a palm against the kitchen counter in frustration because he could feel that the world was beginning to point at the parts of his life he had tried to keep private. It was as if the act of making himself vulnerable had created a compass for attention. Maya felt the shape of the moment like cool metal in her mouth. She had accepted the job knowing there would be scrutiny. She had not expected to be surveilled like game. She thought of the old wound she carried when people assumed her motives were charity or charity's face for pity. She had not come here to be spectacle. She had come to work. That night she sat at the edge of the nursery and opened her notebook. The page had a margin of inked observations, and then, in steadier handwriting, the word that would not leave her: exposure. The word did not come with an immediate solution. It hardly came with comfort. It came with the knowledge that the life she was helping to build could be fragile, not because Eli's progress was fragile, but because others saw power as a place to take advantage. The house seemed quieter that night. Preston walked the corridors like someone rearranging furniture in his head. Maya moved through the rooms with a steady hand, making sure bath water was warm, making sure the nightlight cast its consistent glow. In the morning, when Eli woke and reached for her, his fingers curled into her palm like a claim. The camera's memory existed somewhere out there. A file, a grainy set of pixels. But in the nursery, in the wake of the cry that had started it all, there was something else. A small, stubborn life that was being tended one patient act at a time. They did not yet know the shape of the threat at their door. They did not yet know that a spreadsheet in a glass tower would someday decide to weaponize a welfare report. They did not yet know that those same pixels captured by the lens in the hedgerow would later be used to stitch a narrative that fed on fear. For now, there was a day like any other. A kettle boiled. A sign was made. A child discovered that the world could be predictable if served in small measures. Maya closed her notebook and folded it into her pocket. She looked at Eli, at Preston, at the small archive of tender objects that made up this new life. Then she stepped outside to the garden to look at the hedges through a new pair of eyes. The threat, if it existed, was a shadow for another morning. She inhaled the scent of wet soil and magnolia and held a hope that was not naive but necessary. That ordinary, steady care could be a kind of resistance. The house, for all its glass and marble, had become a kind of refuge. The refuge now would have to be defended. Morning came with a thin, indifferent light that made the mansion look like an instrument under a technician's hands. Maya found the kettle on the stove and let it hiss for a long time before she moved. Eli slept still and honest in the nursery, his small chest rising with a rhythm she trusted. For a moment, she let herself be grateful for the ordinariness, the kettle, the cup, the boy breathing beside a projector that turned the ceiling into a patient night. Then Lionel's message arrived. Short, efficient, the kind of thing that sliced the quiet. "We need you downstairs. Now." He met her in the kitchen with the same face he used when someone needed to know he had a plan. He led her past the service corridor, past the staff entrance, where Mrs. Green was already talking to a line of afternoon workers in low, serious tones. Preston stood in the library, hands in his pockets, jaw taut. The glass walls of his office had stopped reflecting the garden and began instead to mirror worry. "There was an anonymous report filed with Family Services," Lionel said without preamble. "Complaint alleges neglect, inconsistent supervision, and a non-licensed caregiver living in the residence." Maya felt the room tilt. An anonymous complaint, a piece of paper, a line in an intake form, and suddenly 32 hours of careful presence could be passed into suspicion. Her chest narrowed in a way she knew from crowded buses and narrow waiting rooms. "Who filed it?" she asked. Practicality steadied the question. "We don't have a name," Lionel answered. "We have a notice. They may assign a caseworker to perform a welfare check. It could be routine. But—" He left the end of the sentence hanging like an unfinished list. Preston's voice was low. "Could they remove him, temporarily?" "Only if they have cause to believe there's immediate danger," Lionel said. His competence was a relief and a new pressure. "But they can, and they often do, ask for the child to be seen at the agency or request that someone else assumes temporary custody while they evaluate. It's not always permanent, but it can be destabilizing." Preston shut his eyes for a beat. Grief had taught him to measure risk. This was a risk he had not anticipated. "Sandra," he said to Lionel, "get our attorney." When Sandra Griffin arrived, she moved through the room like someone who knew how to translate panic into paperwork. She had a methodical air, organized files, a habit of listening twice before speaking once. She read the notice in silence, then folded it and slid it across the table as if folding a map into smaller, usable pieces. "We'll engage promptly," she said. "We call Family Services. We ask for the name of the caseworker. We invite them here and make our cooperation explicit. We document everything. We'll file whatever motions are necessary to prevent unnecessary removal." "Can we do that?" Maya asked. She felt raw in a way she did not have words for. They can just call and take him? It does happen, Sandra said evenly, but it also happens that with immediate cooperation, clear evidence of care, and third-party testimony, the agency can close the report without removal. The first day is about proof of safety and proof of routine. We'll prepare a file, Dr. Chen's letters, staff affidavits, daily logs. We'll show that the child has a care plan and a team. Dr. Lydia Chen, when she arrived, did exactly what she always did. She set her satchel down like a piece of equipment and looked at the child with the kind of attention that is neither intrusive nor sentimental. Her testimony would center on assessment and care plan, the predictable elements that professionals can translate into the language of court. They prepared a bundle of evidence with a speed that felt almost like creation. Maya watched them work and felt a strange split, grateful for their competence and aware that her life, her brother's nights, her aunt's casseroles, would now be read as evidence in a ledger. She wrote down everything she could imagine someone might ask: routines, sensory preferences, incidents, times, and dates. She signed each page with the same calm hand she used for grocery lists. The caseworker's visit was an awkward, formal thing. A woman with a badge and a pen arrived mid-morning with an air of procedure that seemed to neutralize conversation. She looked through the nursery, asked about routine, about sleep, about food. She watched footage Lionel provided, the nursery camera set to an angle that respected privacy, watched Emma's videos with polite attention and scribbled notes. She spoke with Preston, with Dr. Chen, with Maya. She called the agency office and spoke into a phone, in a voice that told Maya the kind of language officialdom uses when something must be justified in a file. "There's no immediate danger," the worker said when she had seen all she needed. "But I'll be making a recommendation for a short-term monitoring plan. It's standard when there is some concern and a need for follow-up." The recommendation itself had the power to inflame public suspicion if it leaked. It would not remove Eli that day, but it would put the family on a watch list and create the paper trail a media outlet could use. Someone within the house staff suspected it had already leaked. The rumor mill spins on a tinderbox, and it only takes one spark. That afternoon, a reporter called the front desk. A local television crew appeared on the gravel drive before Lionel could bring them to heel. Someone had posted the grainy photographs taken from the hedgerow and a short, sketchy write-up that hinted at neglect. The piece was careful enough to avoid libel, but aggressive enough to plant the image of doubt. Preston moved through the surge of cameras with a kind of dignity that had taken grief to teach him. He faced questions he had never expected to answer in public, about his son's needs, about his hiring choices, about his fitness as a parent despite his wealth. Journalists framed him as a man whose money had been questioned. The narrative that threatened to harden was not simply, did he neglect his son, but a crueler, slanting thing. What is the proper place for people like Maya in houses like his? Maya felt the cameras as if they were hands. They wanted a story in which she fit a neat archetype, the saintly cleaner who rescued a child, or the opportunist who wormed her way into the house. She understood both narratives. She had seen them in the gossip columns when she cleaned homes for clients in other neighborhoods. Her own life had been an accumulation of small truths and necessary compromises. Now those truths were being read for drama. In the days that followed, the leak grew into a smear campaign that bore the faint, manufactured scent of corporate strategy. A series of anonymous tips landed at different outlets. Someone had sent a dossier to a city paper with suggestive notes about liability and parenting in wealth. An op-ed column argued that the boy's safety was being hobbled by the Vale household's unwillingness to accept professional help. The newsroom's algorithms found traction in the story. The more the story took shape, the more real it felt to the people reading it. Inside the house, the staff tightened. Mrs. Green moved through her duties with a steadier set of hands. The chef added a small, unlabeled jar of cinnamon to Eli's morning porridge, and then, when the reporters' vans loomed beyond the gates, chose to leave the porch, in the care of the gardeners, to avoid any accidental photographs. Lionel tightened perimeter protocols and, behind the doors of the security room, began to trace the faint lines that connected certain blog posts to a PR calendar. He worked quietly, a man following digital footprints. What Lionel found was not an obvious crime, but a pattern. A small PR firm had been running a series of reputation attacks, timed to coincide with a corporate acquisition Preston had been negotiating. The firm's work list included targeted narratives aimed to slow the deal. One of their clients was a company with a clear interest in undermining Vale Capital's expansion. It was not proof of a welfare complaint orchestrated by the client's principals, but it was enough to show motive, someone making money from stirring fear in the public to influence a boardroom. Sandra took the thread and made it paper. She filed a motion to quash any unnecessary removal and included in the filing the PR firm's evident pattern, the suspicious timing, and a request for an expedited hearing to prevent a coerced custody arrangement made in the press. The motion argued that the welfare complaint may have been piggybacked onto a corporate strategy and requested judicial oversight of the agency's actions so that the child's stable environment wouldn't be torn by rumor. The press smelled a courtroom drama, and the cameras multiplied. The hearing was scheduled for the week out, and until then the agency's recommendation for monitoring remained in place. The family lived under a bureaucratic microscope, and an online one too. Maya's nights were threaded with calls and meetings. Loretta's voice at the other end of the line was a ballast. "Girl," she said once, the blunt chords of affection in her voice, "you do what you do, and you let the lawyers do what they do. Keep a clean ledger. Keep your head." Her ledger grew fatter. Maya catalogued every action. When she warmed Eli's blanket, what she noted about his appetite, when she called Dr. Chen, the times Preston attempted a sign and stopped himself embarrassed. The practice of listing details steadied her. It translated the messy work of care into a language the court might understand. The hearing itself took on a theatre of its own. The courtroom was a high, neutral room whose furniture suggested neutrality even while the air suffered from partisan signals. Reporters filled the benches like an audience that had slipped into a civic ritual. Judge Adeline Monroe entered like someone who had been taught to weigh both letter and spirit carefully. She had a reputation for a clear, unflashy sense of decency. Someone who saw the law as a tool to protect the vulnerable rather than a weapon to be wielded for spectacle. "Counsel," she said, looking at Sandra and then at an attorney representing the agency. "We will proceed on the record. I will hear preliminary arguments." The attorneys stood and spoke with the measured pace of people who had practiced compassion as a professional skill. The agency's counsel described the filing, the recommendation for monitoring, and the need to ensure Eli's safety in light of public attention. Sandra countered with the files. Dr. Chen's assessment of a care plan, staff affidavits, security log entries, the timeline Lionel had pulled connecting PR spikes to corporate rivalries. She asked for a limited order, no removal, a concrete oversight plan, and an order directing the agency to investigate the source of the anonymous report's leak. "There's a real cost to removal," Sandra argued. "For a child with Eli's needs, displacement can be more traumatic than the threats alleged. We are not indifferent to safety. We insist on a thoughtful, evidence-based approach." Dr. Chen's testimony was precise. She described the child's sensory profile, the importance of routine, and the documented progress under the arranged plan. Her language was clinical but humane. She explained the dangers of abrupt change and the benefits of monitoring that allowed for in-home support rather than removal. Preston testified with an awkward, honest tone. He confessed to emotions more complicated than the cameras could capture: grief, guilt, the rawness of watching his son sometimes recede. He disclosed the steps he had taken to cooperate with therapy, how he had adjusted schedules, and how his priority was the child's safety above any corporate maneuver or reputation. The agency's counsel acknowledged the file, and its origins were murky. They noted that anonymous reports could not be ignored, but argued they should not become instruments for corporate antagonists. Judge Monroe listened with a face that absorbed and did not dramatize. After questioning the agency about the standards for removal and the existence of a care plan, she rendered a measured ruling. "I will deny any petition for removal at this time," Judge Monroe said, her voice a small, steady bell. "However, in light of the public attention, and to ensure continuity of care for this child, I will order a short-term monitoring plan that specifies documented daily contact with the assigned caseworker, a shared care plan routed through Dr. Chen, and a prohibition on disrupting the child's routine unless immediate risk is demonstrated by clear evidence. I will also request the agency's assistance in investigating the potential external influence that produced this complaint." Her ruling was not a sweeping vindication. It was a cautious, legally plausible safeguard intended to preserve the child's well-being. To them, it felt like a victory. Outside the courthouse, the microphones wanted a soundbite. Preston answered with tempered words. Maya did not speak to the cameras. She felt the verdict as if it were a narrow bridge across a river whose waters were still dark. The court's language had kept Eli in place. It had not yet cleared the stain of rumor. Over the next weeks, Lionel's investigation tightened. He found invoices and email exchanges that connected the PR firm to a competitor of Vale Capital. Those emails did not prove that Sylvia Warner or Greg Sinclair had fabricated a welfare complaint, but they did show an orchestrated campaign to shift public perception at a specific moment in the acquisition timeline. Sandra used the material to write letters requesting that media outlets disclose their sources and that the agency look into the provenance of the anonymous complaint. The local editor who had run the initial piece was cooperative when presented with the evidence of orchestration. She ran a follow-up, more measured this time, that described the legal running and the presence of a care plan. The tone of the town shifted, a slow recalibration of interest to sympathy for the child's privacy. The internet, fickle as weather, moved on to other indignities and amusements. But for Maya, the heat of the moment left marks. She had been asked to submit to hours of interviews with caseworkers, and the press had tried to paint her in sharp colors. She found herself feeling raw about conversations in grocery lines, about a neighbor who had seen her leaving the mansion and assumed things she did not. She and Loretta navigated a new reality where a day's work could become an international talking point. Within the household, however, a different currency had been purchased: trust. Preston had watched her at hearings, the woman who had no title in his business but held the most consequential place in his son's life. He had seen how she spoke to Dr. Chen, how she refused to sing for cameras, how she refused to make herself a character in other people's stories. He had watched her choose the longer arc every time. One evening, after a particularly thinning day, they found themselves in the nursery with a stack of blocks and a potted plant that Mrs. Green had placed where the light would reach it. Eli had been restless. The caseworker's visits had introduced a new schedule, and the boy was sensitive to shift. He had been having small flares and then settling, and Maya took the time to replicate a sequence of motion that soothed him. Gravity exercises and a rhythmic rocking with a weighted blanket folded at precise angles. Preston sat with them, and for the first time in her memory asked a question that showed he wanted to be a partner, not a sponsor. "What do you need?" he asked. Maya blinked. Need had been her ledger for so long, she could tally it in her sleep. Rent, Jermaine's therapy, Loretta's meds. The question was not about money, and it did not have to be. It was a separate invitation. "Time off," she said surprisingly. A real weekend off, and... She stopped because asking for more felt like opening an argument that might turn practical gestures into patronage. And a contract that isn't word of mouth. I need something on paper. For Loretta. For Jermaine. He looked at her as if trying on a new shirt. We can do that, he said. He meant it in the way men in his position sometimes meant things, an offer of resources, but this time he paired it with presence. We'll draft a contract, a salaried position, benefits, a contribution to the therapy fund, and weekends. We will schedule them. She let the relief sink in slowly. It was not charity. It was recognition. The difference mattered. Courts closed their dockets, but the larger fight had other stages. The corporate acquisition Preston had been pushing through stalled in the boardroom under the pressure of public perception. The firm that had promoted the smear faced its own inquiries. Sylvia Warner and Greg Sinclair, executives with reputations to defend, held their positions with statements about competition and robust business strategy. It was an ugly ecology where dignity and profit traded places. Lionel continued to follow the trail into private inboxes. He found a thread that suggested the PR firm had been briefed to seed doubt and delay, and that the firm had pitched the story to outlets with insinuations about a lack of professional supervision. It was the sort of morally ambiguous thing that thrives in margins, not explicit criminality, but an intentional exploitation of systems meant to protect children. Sandra used this to demand better source vetting from outlets and to press the agency to pursue the leak. Months moved with a rhythm that was not wholly restful. There were days when progress was a fraction of a sentence, Eli signing more and waiting, then eating another piece of apple. Preston teaching himself to tie the exact knot of a child's sweater. Dr. Chen adjusting a plan after an observation that suggested sensitivity to certain frequencies. There were also days when the internet spat up an old rumor like a shell, and some new blog picked at it. Each time they responded with documentation and persistence. Then on a winter morning that had the bright hardness of glass, Maya received a letter in the mail from a small non-profit in the borough, the Franklin Center for Developmental Support. They had heard the story, had watched the courtroom transcripts online, and were asking if she would speak at a panel about caregiver support and legal rights for families navigating systems of protection. The invitation surprised her. The offer came with a small honorarium and a promise. They wanted someone who could speak plainly about what it meant to care for a child like Eli within a system that often misunderstood both poverty and privilege. She took the panel because something in the invitation felt true to the axis of her life, care made public in a way that did not sensationalize. She spoke in a small room to a gathering of therapists, parents, advocates, and a legal aid attorney who quietly took notes. She told them about routines and weighted blankets, about sign language as a bridge that doesn't insist on quick results, about the need for courts and agencies to recognize presence as a form of safety. What she did not do was turn the story into a hagiography. She traced the edges, why people are skeptical, why grief makes even wealthy parents make odd decisions, why systems can be weaponized. She pressed on the point that stuck with her always. There is risk in exposure, she said. Leaving a life of quiet care unrecognized is the risk we have to take. But when it becomes public, it can be smashed into a narrative that is not ours. Her words moved people. The non-profit asked if she would consider joining their advisory board. Preston asked her what she thought. She said yes to both, with the same clear-headedness that had guided her when she took the mansion job in the first place. The romance that had been an ember in the margins grew with the cautious patience of seasons. It never became a sudden conflagration. Instead, it deepened in small ways. He started bringing home small, practical things. A pair of boots she'd mentioned once, because Loretta had said they would be warmer in winter. A new kettle, because the old one had a crack. He explained decisions to her instead of overriding them. She met his friends for dinner, carefully chosen meals where no cameras were allowed, and he met her family in an old church basement where Loretta made sure to serve enough food and to ask the right, sometimes embarrassing questions. Once, after a late hearing in which the judge had made a particularly kind, matter-of-fact observation about children and stability, Preston walked Maya to her car in the black of night. The estate's magnolia bled ink into the dark. He stopped and turned to her and said simply, "I don't know what I would have done without you." She looked at him, at the man shaped by spreadsheets and a sorrow that had been almost architectural. There was no script in place for the precise shape of gratitude between them. She felt the old nerves, safety, suspicion, the ledger of needs, and something sketched itself into possibility. He reached and took her hand with no show of ceremony. It was small, it was consent. She did not pull away. Their first kiss, when it came, was later and quieter, after the trial had reduced to an undercurrent and a letter from the board signaled the acquisition would proceed with adjustments. They stood in the nursery, and Eli had fallen asleep with a soft nap that tasted like victory. The press had gone on to other pursuits. Mrs. Green hummed in the kitchen. Maya and Preston let the moment unfold like a decision rather than an event. It had a domestic authenticity, an understanding, a mutual recognition that what had begun between them was not relief wrapped in romance, but an expansion of family. Then came the more complicated legal threads. The agency's investigation into the provenance of the anonymous complaint produced irregularities. A paid tip funnel, third-party intermediaries used to seed stories, a PR brief that named the narrative they wished to promote. It was enough to implicate the PR firm's methods and to suggest that a corporate competitor had leveraged those methods. The legal settlement that followed was not a cinematic indictment. It was a quiet dissolution of certain contracts and a statement released by lawyers that valued reputation and closure over confession. In the private arbitration that followed, Vale Capital agreed to withhold naming the rival company publicly in exchange for a retraction and a commitment by the PR firm to changes in practice. The settlement did not undo the human cost. It did not unwrite the late nights or the rounds of anxiety, but it did carve space for restitution, a fund for community developmental services financed quietly by a portion of Preston's capital, and a pledge to create a center dedicated to early intervention resources that would reach neighborhoods like the one Maya had come from. It was part practical, part symbolic, but it mattered. Maya worked with Sandra and Preston to formalize her role. They drew up a contract, clear hours, vacation time, insurance, a retirement plan, a stipend for continuing education, things that were simple and human. They also formalized an advisory role for Maya at the new community center. She became a bridge, a direct voice in policy rather than a nameless figure at the margins of decisions others made. She accepted with the same practical heart she'd used to accept work before, a ledger and a commitment. Eli's progress continued on its irregular arc. He did not undergo miraculous reversals. There was no cinematic sequence where he suddenly spoke in sentences or danced at a graduation. What changed was a deepening of attachment and emerging communication. He began signing more. He began to bring Maya a block and place it in her hand in a way that suggested a question. One evening he reached for a tablet, pressed a recorded clip of Emma's laugh, and then, in a new, small voice, said, "Da," a sound that made Preston stop folding laundry and stand in the doorway as if discovering a world. Dr. Chen celebrated it as a milestone, a sign the boy had a stronger map to the people around him. She reminded them all that milestones are many and scattered, not a single summit. The sense of victory spread through the house, not as noise, but as a steady glow. The community center opened with modest fanfare. The plaque in the lobby read something precise and not self-aggrandizing. The Vale Family Center for Early Development, Resources, Support, and Education. Maya stood in the back at the opening, one woman among a crowd of children and therapists and donors. She listened as senatorial types spoke generically about philanthropy, and then as parents spoke more privately about the anxieties of finding support for their children. She felt a tether to those stories that was not an emotional claiming, but a responsibility. She taught a workshop on consistent routines and sign usage, joined by other caregivers who had their own complicated paths to the room. She told them about practical things, timing transitions, rotating sensory toys, the calm circle that had salvaged many meltdowns in the nursery. She spoke plainly about legal vulnerabilities, about how anonymous complaints could be used as weapons, and about the importance of documenting care in ways the systems would recognize. The group listened with the rapt attention of people used to seeking a map. In the weeks that followed, Preston used his capital in quieter ways. He funded grants for local therapists to train in community contexts and set up a scholarship for Jermaine's continued therapy. He did not do this for accolades. He did it because the work taught him to spend money in ways that were not simply transactions, but investments in people. There were photographs taken on the rare days when the press was allowed in at the family's request. Images that showed small people making small moves. Eli holding a block with Maya and Preston both watching. A garden walk with the three of them under a grey sky. A family photo with a framed picture of Emma at an angle that suggested not erasure, but continuity. Those images circulated, but they did not feel like conquests. They were artifacts. Months settled into a new normal. The monitoring had been phased out once the agency's scheduled follow-ups concluded, and the caseworker recommended closure, an outcome the judge had hoped for. The public chatter dwindled. The community center began to fill with families seeking help. Maya sat on panels, and sometimes she walked into rooms where her name carried weight, not because she had been thrust into fame, but because people recognized the functional authority of someone who had learned through doing. And yet, the story always returned to small things. One morning, Maya found a letter taped to her bedroom mirror in the small cottage she kept as a personal refuge. A drawing from Eli, uneven stars, a crooked magnolia, and two stick figures with hands joined. It was the kind of small artifact that held more truth than 1,000 op-eds. She folded it and put it in her notebook. On a quiet Sunday, Preston and Maya took Eli to a small park in a neighborhood that smelled of caramelized nuts and warm asphalt. The boy walked between them, sometimes touching each of their hands, sometimes slipping ahead. They stopped at a bench and watched other children play. No reporters, no boardrooms, only the hum of a city that could not be reconciled or simplified. "What do you call this?" Preston asked, looking at the three of them. Maya thought of words she had learned working nights in laundromats and afternoons in church basements: shelter, family, work. She chose a word that felt like a small, honest offering. "Home," she said. He nodded, and for a moment the shorthand of their lives made sense in the same way a simple sign can cut through noise. For Preston, the billionaire's secret, the one he had feared and hidden, was not a scandal or a trick. It was vulnerability, the capacity to be seen and to keep showing up anyway. At the center, under fluorescent lights and soft banners, Maya's advisory work began to gather momentum. She shaped a small program, Presence Matters, a curriculum for caregivers that taught low-cost sensory supports, sign basics, and documentation practices for families navigating systems. They piloted it in 3 neighborhoods. Dr. Chen trained a cohort of community therapists who partnered with the center. The program did not promise miracles, it promised tools and a community. When the board gathered to accept the first report of outcomes, they spoke with the cautious optimism of people who know incremental change. Families reported an increase in trust and a decrease in unnecessary emergency visits. Therapists appreciated a more coordinated referral network. Maya listened and spoke rarely. Her presence in the meeting was not an image to be curated. It was a mark of competence, painstakingly earned. One afternoon, a journalist from a national outlet requested an interview. The angle promised a narrative that loved contrasts, opulence and resilience. Maya almost said no, uncomfortable at being used as a lens for someone else's story. But then she thought of the workshop and of the small faces that showed up week after week, and she agreed, on her terms. No sensational framing, no cameras without consent, and a focus on resources. When the piece ran, it was not a fairy tale. It told a story of a caregiver who had become an advocate and a father who had learned to give his presence as a thing. The headline spoke of unexpected partnerships, which was a neat compromise, and then the piece folded into the quiet details. Clinic referrals, the center's modest budget, Dr. Chen's measured explanations. It did what journalism could do at its best. It shifted attention back to systems rather than personalities. There were small recognitions. A local foundation nominated Maya for a Community Leadership Award. She accepted with a humility that surprised the committee. She gave her stipend to the new occupational therapy grant and signed the check with the same hand she used to write Eli's logs. Preston resisted public praise for her too. He wrote an honest note of appreciation in the center's ledger, praising the work rather than the woman as savior. Time, with the gentle tyranny it holds, softened some edges. Eli's language grew in fits, a word here, a longer phrase there. He learned to play a simple game with other children at the center, to pass a ball slowly rather than flinging it. The signs became a choreography that sometimes turned to laughter. He grew, not cured, but attended to. The household became an ecosystem rather than a fortress. The court's decision, the PR firm's settlement, and the boardroom shifts were all part of the larger shape of things. The real change was in the daily motions, the folding of socks, the blocking of a noisy room, the practice of a sign until it became a new habit for a father. Those were the things that no headline could argue away. On an anniversary of sorts, 1 year from the cry that had started it all, Preston held a small dinner. He invited the staff who had stood with them through the months, Mrs. Green, Lionel, Sandra, Dr. Chen, Loretta, and a handful of therapists from the center. The table was modest, roasted vegetables, a simple cake, a pitcher of tea. Emma's videos played quietly on an old monitor in the corner, not as a shrine, but as a membrane of memory that allowed them to trace a past alongside a present. They shared toasts that did not swell into rhetoric. Mrs. Green toasted persistence and the right to be human. Dr. Chen toasted the virtues of steady routines and evidence. Preston, with a voice that had the scar of grief softened into gratitude, raised his glass to the staff who make this house a home. Maya listened and felt the measure of the gratitude as a substance that could be trusted. After dinner they walked to the nursery, where Eli had already fallen asleep with a soft weight to his body. In the doorway, Preston turned to Maya and, with something like a formal gesture, handed her a small envelope. Inside was the formal contract that solidified her position, caregiver and family liaison, with the protections she had asked for. He'd insisted on a clause that granted her autonomy to step back when she wished, to refuse public appearances, and to retain her advisory role at the center independent of the household payroll. "It's important to me that you keep your life," he said. "Not only because it's fair, but because you showed me how to hold my life better." She read the contract quickly and then slid it into her apron pocket. They stood there in the hush of night, two grown people learning to be kin in a way that had nothing to do with blood. They did not make promises that would solve a lifetime, but they agreed on small things: weekends, truthful conversation, an intent to resist power's temptations. Years later, the framed photograph on the nursery wall captured a moment that had once felt impossible. A trio on a garden bench, with the magnolia in the background, hands touching, not clinging, but connected. Tucked beneath the frame was a small plaque, inscribed with Emma's name and a line Preston chose: "Presence is the bravest thing we can offer." The idea pleased Maya not because it was eloquent, it wasn't, but because it was true. The Franklin Center's program expanded and modestly influenced policy conversations. A city committee asked for input on how to reduce the weaponizing of welfare reports in corporate disputes. The committee included advocates who had learned from Maya's testimony. They drafted suggestions for more robust source verification in media and for agency protocols that prioritize family preservation in the absence of imminent danger. Change was slow and partial, but it moved. And in the kitchen of the Vale house, where the kettle still hissed in 100 small ways, the three of them, Maya, Preston, and Eli, sat sometimes in the evening and did the regular work of being family. Eli, older now by degrees, would take blocks and pass them to Maya, who would put them in careful stacks. Preston would read aloud from a book Emma had loved, his voice sometimes faltering, sometimes steady. Maya thought of Germaine, of Loretta, of the nights when the world had felt like a pinched place. She thought about the ways presence had been a kind of resistance, presence that refused to perform for a camera, that refused to be neutral in the face of systems designed to take from the vulnerable and hand to the powerful. She was tired sometimes. She was paid now in ways that made rest possible. She had new enemies in the sense of people who would prefer such work remain invisible. But she had something steadier, a life arranged in part by choice rather than necessity, the narrative that the world kept trying to make out of them. The billionaire and his maid and the child with an unlabeled condition had been reframed by the slow accumulation of small truths. The secret that the title of so many imagined stories had hoped to pry out was not a trick or a scandal. It was simply that money could not substitute for staying. Privilege could provide access. It could not on its own build attachment. The real transformation had come from daily insistence, from team-based support, from a father learning to be present, from a caregiver who refused both to be ornamental and to be erased. On the wall in the Franklin Center, a simple quote framed the meeting room where Maya taught, "Listening is an act of respect." She had learned to sign that sentence slowly and to mean it in ways that went beyond words. She taught parents to listen to rhythm, to light, to the small ways a child points toward safety. One autumn afternoon, as light slanted through stained glass and the magnolia shed its leaves like confetti on the path, Eli left a tidy stack of blocks by the nursery door, a small offering. Maya picked one up and held it like a small geometry of days. Preston came in and sat beside her, and without fanfare they held hands. It was not a dramatic scene, it was a quiet confirmation. If this story moved you, consider supporting autism awareness organizations or local early intervention programs. Links are in the description. Share this to help build awareness for families who need steady care, not sensational headlines.